But what if I told you that Australia and Canada, two nations separated by over 14,000 kilometers of ocean, are like long-lost economic twins? It's true. On the surface, the similarities are striking. Both are proud members of the Commonwealth of Nations, sharing a British colonial heritage. Their governments are structured almost identically as federal states and constitutional monarchies. Both nations also manage the unique challenge of having relatively small populations spread across vast and often inhospitable landscapes. What's particularly fascinating is how their people cluster. Nearly 80% of Canada's population lives within 100 miles of the US border, huddling close to their southern neighbour. Meanwhile, Australia sees a similar concentration, with the vast majority of its population clinging to its beautiful coastlines. But the real story, the one we're diving into today, is their economies. If Australia and Canada were a single country, their combined economy would be the world's fifth largest, bigger than India and nipping at the heels of Japan. They even have similar levels of wealth per person, with Australia at around $63,000 and Canada at $58,000. So, are they just two peas in a pod? Or does a closer look reveal a rivalry, a story of one twin pulling ahead of the other? The answer might surprise you, and it holds critical lessons about wealth, innovation, and the future of our global economy. To understand Australia and Canada, you have to start with what's under their feet. Both economies are built on a foundation of immense natural wealth. Their primary sectors, mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, are strikingly similar. The main difference? Australia leans more heavily on mining, while Canada has a slightly stronger manufacturing base. This shared reliance on resources means their economic heartbeats often sync up. If you look at how their stock markets have moved over the past 30 years, they follow an almost identical path. Why? Because the fortunes of both nations rise and fall with the global demand for the commodities they export. This isn't a new story. Back in the late 1800s, a massive gold rush made the town of Charters Towers in Queensland, Australia, so wealthy that it opened its own stock exchange. More than a century later, Queensland felt the echoes of that history as another mining boom, this time for iron ore and coal, came to an end. At its peak, investment in mining was so massive it made up 9% of Australia's entire GDP, largely driven by a frantic rush to supply China's insatiable appetite for iron ore and coal. This led to a huge spike in profits. But when global demand and prices for these commodities inevitably dropped, mining companies slammed the brakes on new projects, leading to less spending and fewer jobs across the country. Canada has ridden the same roller coaster. In the 1950s, the country witnessed one of North America's first major oil booms. For most of the last 30 years, rising investment in oil and gas has fueled increases in production and exports. As technology improved and prices rose, the focus shifted to the colossal oil sands projects in Alberta. But since 2008, falling oil prices have put a damper on that growth, sending economic shockwaves from Western Canada all the way to the central provinces and causing a contraction in related service and manufacturing sectors. This economic mirroring extends right into their corporate worlds. For example, the Australian firm Macquarie is the biggest manager of infrastructure investments on the planet. And who's right behind them in second place? Canada's Brookfield. But here's where a crack in the twin facade appears. When you look at the biggest companies globally by revenue, a list dominated by American and Chinese titans, you have to scroll way down to find the top players from our two countries. Canada's Brookfield Asset Management ranks at 117, and Australia's biggest, the mining company BHP Group, comes in at 180. Outside of their resource giants, it seems Australian and Canadian firms have forgotten how to compete on the world stage. Instead of competing globally, they dominate locally. And they dominate in a way that would be unthinkable in a market like the United States. Let's talk groceries. In Australia, just two supermarket chains, Coles and Woolworths, control a staggering 59% of the entire market. Over in Canada, Loblaws and Sobeys sell 34% of all groceries. To put that in perspective, that's more than the top 4 grocery stores in the US sell combined. It's the same story with banking. The 4 biggest banks in both Australia and Canada hold on to 3/4 of all the money deposited by the public. In the US, the top banks have less than half of that share. The list goes on. In both countries, domestic aviation is essentially a duopoly, and the telecommunications market is a triopoly. One reason for this is that in smaller economies, companies may need to reach a certain massive scale just to be viable and afford things like complex IT systems. The result? These Australian and Canadian national champions, particularly in groceries and banking, are significantly more profitable than their American counterparts. This intense focus on resources and domestic markets has led some to wonder if Australia and Canada suffer from a version of the resource curse. This is a phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources experience problems like political unrest or slow growth. For Australia and Canada, it's more subtle. Their reliance on resources seems to have made them less interested in developing other industries that could compete worldwide. That might be why, apart from commodities and some iconic niche products like Australia's top surf clothing labels or Canada's famous parkas and winterwear, there aren't many big global brands from either country. Of course, they are titans in what they do best. Canada boasts the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves, with massive deposits in Alberta's tar sands. Australia, on the other hand, dominates the global markets for coal and iron ore. It's also the world's biggest producer of lithium, the third largest of cobalt, and the fourth largest of rare earths, the critical minerals of the future. But there's a huge flip side to this story. Both countries are finding it tough because they are incredibly reliant on selling their goods to much bigger economies. Australia is deeply tied to the economic fate of China. A huge chunk of what Australia sells are broadine, ore, coal, and natural gas to China to power its vast manufacturing sector. In 2023, these goods made up a massive part of Australia's export earnings, showing just how much Australia counts on China's business. In the exact same way, Canada's economy is fundamentally tied up with the United States. The US is Canada's #1 trading partner, and this relationship is the cornerstone of Canada's prosperity. A significant portion of Canada's exports, from cars to energy, are destined for the American market. This means Canada's economic health is directly impacted by US demand and US policy. This reliance on digging things up and selling them has created a strange paradox. For two of the most educated and talented countries in the world, they are surprisingly lacking at the cutting edge of technology. Products that the World Bank considers high-tech, like aerospace, computers, pharmaceuticals, and scientific instruments, make up over 7% of exports for the average developed nation. For Canada, that number is only 4%. For Australia, it's a dismal 2%. The data on new ideas tells a similar story. Patents granted per 10,000 people are a mere 5.9 in Canada and 6.7 in Australia. That pales in comparison to 9.9 in America and a world-leading 28.2 in South Korea. Now, this doesn't mean Australians and Canadians lack talent. Far from it. They rank highly in global talent rankings, boast top-notch universities, and have some of the highest rates of higher education in the world. The problem isn't the people, it's the system. Spending on research and development is shockingly low, around 7% to 8% of GDP in both countries, well below the developed world average of 7%. Venture capital investment, the money that funds explosive new businesses, was just $8 billion for both countries combined in 2023, about half of what it was the year before. To top it off, they remain relatively closed to foreign investment, with strict rules that make it hard for outsiders to come in and shake things up. But there is one area where both countries are incredibly open: immigration. Both Australia and Canada are global hotspots for people seeking a new life. Immigration plays a crucial role in their economies and their long-term success. Without it, both of their populations would rapidly age. Immigrants bring diversity, innovation, and a vast spectrum of skills that fill critical gaps in sectors like technology, healthcare, and engineering. They don't just expand the labor force, they boost consumer demand, stimulating the entire economy. However, this success has a well-known side effect: a housing crisis. The constant influx of new people has significantly impacted the housing markets in both Canada and Australia, contributing to soaring property prices in major cities. As two of the most popular destinations for immigrants, cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Sydney, and Melbourne have seen demand for housing skyrocket. The average home in Canada now costs nearly $650,000, which is more than 9 times the average household income. And while this problem exists across the rich world, the gap between home prices and what people actually earn is particularly extreme in these two countries. So, we've established they are twins, but not identical. And for decades, one twin has been quietly outperforming the other. Despite all their similarities, Australia seems to be doing better overall. They differ notably in 2 critical areas: productivity and the growth of living standards. Productivity is a huge deal. It's the magic ingredient that measures how efficiently a country can turn work, materials, and ideas into valuable goods and services. And for a long time, Australia has been doing really well here. Meanwhile, Canada, like many other wealthy countries, has seen wages stagnate for decades. Right now, Australia is ahead of Canada by $4 when it comes to productivity, meaning they produce more value for every single hour worked. Since 1990, Australia's income growth per person has been, on average, 0.5 percentage point higher than Canada's every single year. These might seem like tiny differences, but over 30 years, they stack up into a huge gap. It's the reason the average income in Australia is about $63,000, while Canada's is closer to $58,000. So what was Australia's secret? The answer lies in a series of brave and extensive economic reforms that began in the early 1980s. Australia opened its economy to foreign trade, deregulated its markets, privatized state-owned businesses, and introduced sweeping competition reforms. Put simply, the Australian economy has outperformed Canada's because of one key factor: investment. Until very recently, Australia has sustained a much higher level of investment as a share of its economy. And that investment is what pays for the new innovations and technologies that drive productivity growth. The fortunes of Australia and Canada are deeply tied to the unpredictable world of commodities. There was a time, back in the early 2010s, when the boom was so strong that their GDP per person briefly surpassed that of the United States. It shows how quickly their luck can change. Looking to the future, they face divergent paths. Canada's heavy reliance on exporting oil and gas could face serious challenges as the world pushes to reduce carbon emission. Australia, on the other hand, might be perfectly positioned. It holds vast reserves of the minerals like copper and lithium that are essential for the transition to greener technologies. But Australia has its own Achilles heel: its dependence on China. In 2020, China began limiting imports of Australian goods in what was seen as a political power play. Australia managed surprisingly well, and those restrictions have since eased. However, if China's much-predicted long-term economic slowdown finally happens, it could hit Australia hard. Australia and Canada are not about to collapse. They remain 2 of the wealthiest, most stable and desirable countries on Earth. But their shared story is a cautionary tale. It shows how a reliance on natural resources can lead to concentrated markets and a lack of global competitiveness. It reveals a paradox of having immense talent but a system that struggles to foster breakthrough innovation. Australia's reforms gave it an edge that has compounded for decades. But as they look to the future, both of these economic twins must confront their weaknesses. How they navigate the global energy transition and their relationships with the world's superpowers will define their prosperity for the next century. Their foundations are strong, but the cracks are showing, and ignoring them could cause serious problems down the road.